It's my pleasure to interview Christine Moser, who is an associate professor at the VU University in Amsterdam. She's also an associate editor at the Academy of Management Learning and Education. And today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence in organizations, but also the impact of artificial intelligence in education. And so the first question I'd like to ask you, Christine, is, do you think with the advent of generative AI, there are skills that are becoming less critical or even obsolete due to the widespread adoption of generative AI technologies? And what do you think those skills would be?
Thanks, Antoine. Thanks for inviting me. And as a little disclaimer, I'm not a job market expert, but we already see that some jobs are being made obsolete by the organizations. For example, designers are being fired at newspaper organizations. Same goes for marketeers for writing copy. These kinds of things. People in help desks, to some extent, are also being made redundant because of chatbots and so on. So yes, there's definitely a change going on in skills. However, I also think that while some jobs disappear, these might not be the most valuable jobs that have ever existed, and other jobs are emerging as well. So we'll see. It's a reshift. It's a change. To what extent people will really lose their jobs, I'm not so sure yet. Especially in Europe, we see that there's a absolute shortage of laborers, and especially in jobs which are not yet made redundant or under a lot of threat by AI, including crafts, service jobs, care, education, and so on.
Great, thank you. So you've done quite a lot of work around algorithmic decision-making, and possibly some of that translate into what's happening with generative AI. But in the context of your work, can you provide some insight into how organizations have had to adapt or will have to adapt in response to certain tasks being performed by artificial intelligence instead of human beings?
Well, I think there's two very different ways in which organizations are already using AI and will be using even more in the future. One is to enhance particular tasks. For example, ChatGPT right now is not yet entirely replacing humans. People use it to, for example, improve their text. Students use it to actually write text, but there's still a human involved in all steps of the process. However, another set of AI applications is actually executing tasks quite autonomously. Think about an application for, let's say, a loan or something. If the organization providing the loan has set parameters in such a way that if you fill out, yes, I was convicted for a crime, would automatically exclude you. That means you won't even reach ever a human in that organization. So that's two very different things, and that's very important to note, because a very important point about this whole use of AI in organizations is, I think, how organizations and especially people in the organizations deal with it. So in my work, I look at AI, but more broadly technology, and how people interact with that technology, and how that interaction with something which we broadly label technology may also change how we actually work in these organizations. So that's very important, because the realization here is that using an app, an application, a model will change whatever we use it for, right? And in ChatGPT, this change will be maybe a little bit more incremental than, of course, if you use a model to make decisions quite autonomously. So also what's a very important thing here is that for things like ChatGPT, aside from all the critical points that we should make about such models, is that it's relatively transparent to understand what happens in such a model. For other models, especially machine learning and deep neural network models and all of that, so you should ask a computer scientist exactly what it is. but models involving very many difficult steps in their execution, it becomes increasingly impossible, or is impossible, to understand what has happened in the past. So then if you use such a model to make autonomous decisions, it will be impossible to explain why models have made these decisions. And that's very important for organizations to realize. So as an organization, the first question is, so what do I use my models for? And the second is, can I actually, can I stand behind that use? So can I really legitimately say, yes, I can explain how a particular decision was made. And if you cannot explain it, then it must be super clear that it's okay to not being able to explain. So in my view, using AI in organizations means that managers and CEOs really need to be on top of their game. They need to know which models are being used to what purpose, and really scrutinize what's going on in order to be super sure, 100% sure that you are not violating any moral or ethical code of conduct, for example, or social norms or so.
Thank you. Well, I think one thing that you talked about that I think is very interesting and is quite a difficult problem is this issue of interpretability, right? And a lot of models that use deep learning, you don't have. It's very hard to interpret what has happened inside the model to lead to the output, and we see that in some of the research that is looking at output from ChatGPT. To understand whether it's biased in a situation or another, it's only looking at output. You can't really open the black box of the model to interpret the different step that led to that output. Do you think that's a fair way of describing that what issue can arise with interpretability?
Yes, absolutely. As far as I know from computer scientists, but it has been a few months since I talked to them, so things might have changed in the meantime, is that there's no way to really interpret at all. The reason I said for ChatGPT it's a bit more straightforward is that it's only a language model, so it uses language. The issue, of course, is we don't know which language because we don't know the input parameters data. We also don't know the model, so we don't know really what's going on, except that the outcomes are not 100% correct. For other models, I think and there was a recent piece also saying that the hallucinations of large language models stay in the current model. So the way it's built right now, these will stay there. You can fix them in a way, which is then likely to be a problem not to be solved. Not so sure what to do with it. So for me, that simply means do not rely on these models at all, because you never know when you're in this 20% which misperform or are simply wrong. And as for the bias, well, the thing is, of course, biases are local things. So different groups of people have different biases. So the one group says, oh, this is a bias, whereas the other group says, no, this is just normal. The model can fix it because the model is global. So it does not, it's not able to cater to a particular context or group of people. And in that sense, it can never be unbiased, because how could it, right? So that's something that also is simply part of it. And any attempt to make a model unbiased will, I think for that reason, necessarily fail. Does not mean that we cannot try and have these models not violate, for example, very basic human rights, right?
Thank you. We've talked a bit about what AI might mean in organizations in terms of what skills are less valuable. But do you think there are certain skills that maybe have increased in importance as a result of the diffusion of generative AI?
I think it's still early days, but for sure, many different organizations, professions, and industries are asking themselves that questions, including ours, right? As educators, the burning question right now is what's our role in the classroom? What is our students' role in the classroom? Because, in a thought experiment, you can imagine that I have ChatGPT write my assignment. you as my student use ChatGPT to make the assignment, then I use it again to grade it, and so on. So what's the point then? So exactly, that's the question, and I think that's a good question and an important one for many organizations who use or who work with so-called knowledge workers or advisors, experts, and so on. The question is obsolete for the baker around the corner. It's also obsolete for people who actually take care of other people. So I think the answer perhaps lies to some extent in what are the characteristics and the values of these jobs which we do with our hands, not only with our mind, and where does that value lie, and then think really about, okay, which jobs in our organization do need these values, and which maybe do not, and have been maybe not the most attractive jobs anyways in the universe.
So it's interesting what you say about some of the job being displaced being probably not the best jobs that exist anyway. Do you think that means there's a chance that displacement, even though there's a period of transition, and those transitions are always painful because that means layoff and potentially retraining, etc., and that means people are struggling at least for a period of time while they're retraining. Do you think there's a chance that would lead to higher quality jobs? But do you have any idea what that might look like?
That's a good question. I think the quality of a job really lies in the eye of the beholder, the person doing the job. There is a tendency for Western society to create bullshit jobs, as we know. So really meaningless jobs where there's no meaningful work or job crafting or whatever. Probably there are some jobs which could qualify as bullshit jobs, but are still meaningful for the people. So I'm not there to judge them. But of course, there's also really stupid jobs or really hard jobs, which where it might help to have automation. But it's like maybe back in the Industrial Revolution, back in the day, where some improvements were made also for workers, but other things disappeared, and other things really got worse. So I don't know yet. But definitely Western societies and also some Asian societies, to my knowledge, have huge problems with finding workers for really important jobs. So I don't think that this shift is necessarily a very painful one. Also, many people, they don't want to sit in one job for their whole life. Here in the Netherlands, we have to work a little bit longer as well. So it might not be the worst thing on earth to maybe have a different job every now and then if you want to do that, and make that one a meaningful one. And of course, what will be painful is the re-evaluation of jobs. I'm not saying a call center job is now a really valuable job, but it does pay probably more than if you take care of elderly people part-time, which is not how it should be. And of course, some high-paying jobs provide very little value, at least to society, and that should change so that we really value actually what is really important to keep society going.
Thank you. And so to wrap up on my questions on organizations, what do you think are some strategies that organization can employ to help their workforce remain relevant and adaptable in a world in which generative AI is widely available?
Yeah, as I said, I think organizations really need to think about what is their value proposition. Perhaps increasingly also really think about what's your value proposition to society, not only to the shareholders. So really going back to a double two pillars of your organization, which anchor you in society. And then think about how does it translate into our jobs? What are these jobs? What do they really offer us? What is the uniqueness of our people to us? Really think very carefully about that. And again, make sure that you really know what AI is being used for in the organization, so that you don't end up in a situation using it per accident, or it doing things you didn't actually plan for it to do, which can lead to extreme problems and a risk for many people.
now I'd like to ask you a few questions about the impact of generative AI in education. So, I mean, like me, you teach students every year. What do you see as the potential drawbacks or challenges that are associated with the use of generative AI in university settings? Like some of those, like me, you probably already encountered, but what are those that you see are still to come as well?
Well, I would first look at the opportunities, to be honest, because I think what this technology does is really force us to go back to our values. So what is our value proposition to our students? What is the worth, the value of being on campus, of sharing a room, a space with other people? What is my added value? What can I actually give to students which a machine can't, or a video? So that's a really good question, and I feel we have neglected it for quite a while. The same goes for assessment. So the question really should be, what do I actually want my students to learn here? What do I want them to take away to the future? What do I want them to, remember in 10 years' time? It's not writing the 10th essay in their student career. Of course it's not. So what's behind that? What is the actual value of our education in business schools? And the business schools is here important because business schools are also very well known we educate future managers and leaders, and at the same time we haven't done such a good job in educating responsible leaders. So there's a lot of opportunity for really thinking about how to teach, for example, ethics, which is something the machine cannot understand, given it's a machine and not a human being. How do we, for example, also teach our students to engage in conversations, in dialogue, which will be needed to tackle all these problems that are happening right now at the same time in this kind of perfect storm. So we need people who are able to talk to each other, to talk to people from other industries. This is stuff which I find we need to teach, or we need to kind of engage in, and which machines cannot do. They can help us do that, but they cannot replace, for example, sharing our experiences and expertise in that sense. So will it change education? Yes, but I do hope that, because it really it forces us to go back to the drawing board and really think about what do we offer, what do we want students to take away, what is our role here, that we end up with a much better business education, hopefully.
You make a very interesting point about what it is that we want students to take away. And again, a lot of what we do in the context of a degree is we have to evaluate and assess students because we have to find ways of deciding how we confer degrees. But this is only a means to an end. And the end is, what do people live with, and do the students we train become responsible managers, responsible leaders in the longer term? And that's at least I find, a very difficult thing to do. And it's not always clear what kind of impact you could have. Which brings me to my next question, which is something that I find I'm quite excited about it, but at the same time, I am not sure how to use it in a way that is both responsible and effective, which is the potential use of large language models, for example, for personalized learning as a tutor that goes alongside. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited about it because obviously that's another resource that the student can get to get help that's more tailored than what we can provide in the context of a classroom. But there's also the risk that personal tutor that is a machine and is, as we know, subject to hallucinations, for example, could also tell the student things that are going to then lead to the students, for example, getting a low mark because they'll have taken for granted something they've been told by one of the large language models that they've been using. But in fact, that was an hallucination and it's wrong. And I'm not quite sure how to balance that potential benefit with the potential risk. I was wondering if you had any, in your experience, you had find any way of using those large language models that you found were beneficial in the classroom.
So I think here I would go back to my earlier point about what kind of autonomy do you grant the system which you use. And for now, I would not risk too much autonomy here. I want to be in charge. I am in charge of my students, right? I'm the tutor or lecturer. So if I allow a system to replace me, then I need to know 100% what's going to happen there. Perhaps in future we have large language models which allow you to put certain boundaries around it, which is now not the case, right? Or maybe there's some app out there which allows you to for example, restrict the topics the model is allowed to discuss or whatever. I'm not aware of them, could be, but this would be one way, so that you really only can interact with this thing about, for example, your schedule, your learning goals, which are pre-programmed. So simply meaning that if there would be a way to curb the hallucinations, or at least to control them, that's it, then that might be, but still I would really want to test it out personally. Until then, I will use this stuff, for example, to allow students to write better quality language. So, because that's a nice thing, right? You get much less crap essays. But at the same time, of course, try to still have them themselves think what should be in the essay, the argumentation, the critical reflection, and so on. So in that sense, it would be kind of a Word 2.0 where the language is being corrected, but not the content, of course. But that's my personal take on it, simply because I wouldn't want to give away control over my role in that process. And if I would use a co-pilot or whatever, without really knowing what the co-pilot would tell my students, that would be, for me, a little bit of a risky situation. Because how do you know what they are being told, right?
Well, that's the problem, right? Is you can't review everything. And even if you ask the student to submit every query they've submitted to a model, you can't control that that's actually what's happening. And it's also it's an approach to education that reduces the autonomy of the student, implies increased workload for the people having to look through that material for a benefit that is not clear, right? So, I mean, that brings me to the next question. Do you think restricting or trying to regulate heavily the use of AI in the classroom is something that's possible, reasonable, or it's better to have a permissive approach to it in a controlled way in as much as possible?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to restrict it. Students are usually ahead in terms of how to work around what we come up with. So right now they are totally ahead, I think. Maybe not all of them. We shouldn't generalize, but many. So that's just a no-go. And just like with other technological developments, the regulators are always one step behind as well. So there are some apps figuring out AI-created text, but because it doesn't plagiarize, that's not really working well. So in the end, you end up having no proof, which means you cannot really police like in the old-fashioned way. And maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe it should not be about policing, but we should think about ways in which we really assess the process of learning and the attitudes and skills that students come up with instead of the end product, which we have done for many, many years, which maybe is not the best way to actually assess a student's skills and learning goal achievement. That's my stance on it. And how to use it, I think that really, really depends on the learning goals of particular courses. So in that sense, I think that in business schools, we should see probably much more variation in assessments, simply because a person doing a finance degree needs, let's say, coding skills, which it's, for me, I think it's absolutely fine to use, for example, ChatGPT as a kind of luxury search engine, which gives you the code. Simply, that's what it does. It retrieves it. There's little generation about that. However, in other more, for example, writing-heavy programs, then the question is how to assess that students actually have are good in writing as a skill. So what is actually that skill? So for some disciplines, it's okay. They can continue and use the technology to simply, like, you know, at some point we had SPSS and then we used it, and then there came R and we used it. So this is, in that sense, a next step. And for others, it does more thoroughly disturb the status quo, meaning going back to what are now these skills that we want students to learn. And therefore how to use it really depends on the program and then the particular course. So which learning goals should be covered in these courses, and what can you do to assess them? Given also keeping in mind that, of course, we by now know that you know, you have different learning styles, you have different learning approaches, you have, our students are different, especially here at in the VU Amsterdam. We have a very high number of first generation students, but also others very international. So it's all very mixed. There's not the one student does not exist, which means that I think we should and need to take into account this heterogeneity as well when thinking about assessing students.
Now, maybe to wrap up, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about some of your recent research that was around algorithmic decision making and the effect that has on, that automating decisions has on the way those decisions are made, but also, and that's the point you were making with your co-authors, for example, in a paper in the Academy of Management Learning and Education, that algorithmic decisions potentially have an effect on the morality of decisions. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about what does it mean for technology to change morality? How does that happen, and how this translate, or how does that happen in the context of generative AI as well as older algorithmic decision-making technologies?
So how it happens, it's quite simple. So let's start with the kind of what's not realistic, but very common. The common understanding of how a human views technology, including AI, is that we are in control. It's a tool which we can use at our leisure. It helps us to do things. It enhances what we do, and so on. But we know from quite a lot of research that this is a quite limited view on things. So in the tradition of many different researches and also many different disciplines, I would sort this under the denominator of socio-materiality, which simply states that the social and the material, they hang together. You cannot really divide them. A very simple example, which a friend of mine always uses, is if you walk along a path and there's a big building in your way, you will walk around the building. You cannot ignore it. It shapes your way, right? So in that sense, technology also shapes our social interaction in ways that can be intended, but very often are also unintended. And this it's simply, for me, it's a fact of life that whatever we use, it shapes our interactions, our behavior, and so on. In that sense, it has agency. If we define agency as the power to change whatever we do. And the same goes for this influence on morality, because if we are not in charge of technology, that's one. But also, let's say technology is not yet in charge of us, which is also the case, because we're still in control of some things, at least. The truth must lie somewhere in the middle. That there are some things which we already kind of lost control about, but others we are in control. So that's what we call the co-constitution here. And that same goes about morality, simply because morality is it's a human process, a group social process, but it's also kind of permeated by all kinds of technology, including AI. And very simple examples always are, if you simply look at technology, if you try and figure out how often during the day you use your smartphone for which things, and then try to imagine you don't have that smartphone. So that's how technology simply disrupts, or, we don't feel it like that. But if you don't have your phone, you will notice how it disrupts our daily lives. And then if we simply would focus on anything moral, so involving moral interactions or actions or behavior, then the same thing happens. That's more or less it in a nutshell. By the way, there's one important thing to say, because this is a distinctly Western perspective, or at least it's a perspective that does not hold for everybody on the planet. First of all, because not everybody on the planet owns a smartphone, right? Not everybody has access to internet, and so on. So the degree of how much our social life in general, and also organizational life is intertwined with technology is very, very different. So in that sense, sometimes it seems like this generative AI has completely changed the whole planet. It hasn't. It has parts of it. And for us, it's very important, because we live in highly technologized societies. But of course, many other people would not share this view on things, simply because they are not as exposed to technology as we are.
Maybe to wrap up, is there any important aspects or contribution of your work that you think are relevant to artificial intelligence and to the diffusion of artificial intelligence that we haven't covered so far?
Well, one is we have covered this a little bit, but simply to be very aware of what you do and not do. For us as educators, but also for managers, really try and understand what this technology does, because usually people, they don't have the time, or they don't understand, and then they don't want to speak up, but really try and understand what's happening there. Because, the company you buy the AI from, they will tell you only the pretty bits, of course, simply because they want to make their sale, but really try and take responsibility for how you're using it. And another aspect we haven't really talked about, and which is pretty absent from the literature as well, is the environmental consequences of this AI usage, or not so much environmental, maybe CSR consequences, because using these building and using the models is very is extractive, in the sense that, first of all, these models use a lot of energy. So it's really, it's very wasteful using AI. And secondly, the way that these models are built means that right now, lots of people have to spend hours and hours and hours to code stuff. So if you can imagine that if you want AI to recognize child porn, then before it's able to do that, actual people have to watch that stuff and label it. That's really exploitative, especially because it's usually not people in these countries that use the AI. No, it's usually people in countries where people don't have a choice but do that shit work, to be honest. So that's two things already, which are actually not good news about AI. And then thirdly, the way that it's being propagated is usually very kind of positive. It's so good. It will help us in so many ways. Well, is it? Maybe it's time to think a little bit more nuanced about the possibilities, but also downsides of what's going on. So really think deeply about, what does it mean for morality? What does it actually mean for skills? In statistics class, people still learn how to, for example, do a correlation by hand. So why is that? Because we have a calculator for ages already, right? So what is actually the value of being able to writing a text by yourself? Maybe it's because the process of writing is akin to the process of thinking, and there's value to us being able to do stuff ourselves. There's so much we are already not able to really do anymore. Maybe it's time to become conscious of that and be a little bit more conscious about what technology we use and for what purpose.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Christine, thank you very much for talking to me today. That was very informative and insightful, and I really learned a lot.
Thanks so much, Antoine.